Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most important revolutions. Not with guns or declarations of independence, but with thread, literal thread, twisted plant fibers that someone somewhere in the mountains decided to turn into something useful. For the next hour or so, we're going to watch very, very slowly as the Inca people turned string into empire, patience into power, and mind-numbing repetition into one of the most sophisticated civilizations the Americas ever knew. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from. So drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. A journey that moves at exactly the pace the Inca intended, which is to say, not very fast at all. We're going to explore the evolution of Inca textile looms, and I promise you, nothing about this story involves speed. No dramatic battles, no sudden revelations. Just the slow, methodical process of people figuring out over thousands of years how to turn fuzzy plant material into cloth, and then how to turn that cloth into currency, into status, into religion, into the very foundation of a civilization that would eventually stretch from modern-day Colombia to Chile. The Inca built the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. They did it without writing, without the wheel, and somehow without anyone getting particularly excited about it, because the Inca secret weapon wasn't exciting. It was methodical, repetitive, and hypnotically boring in the best possible way. It was weaving thread by thread, day by day, generation by generation, while other civilizations rose and fell in dramatic fashion. The Inca just kept weaving. But before we get to the Inca themselves, we need to go back, way back, to a time before empires, before cities, before anyone had figured out that you could organize thousands of people into doing anything coordinated at all. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the Andes Mountains, around 3000 BCE. The altitude hits you first. Thin air that makes your lungs work harder for every breath. The cold comes next. That penetrating mountain cold that seeps into your bones even when the sun is shining. And then the smell, llamas and alpacas grazing on the hillsides. Their distinctive musky scent carried on wind that never seems to stop blowing. You're standing on a mountainside so steep that flat ground is a theoretical concept. Everything is either uphill or downhill. And your modern legs, used to sidewalks and level floors, are already protesting. The landscape stretches out in shades of brown and green and gray, punctuated by snow-capped peaks that seem close enough to touch but are actually days of walking away. You reach instinctively for your phone to check the time, to orient yourself, to do that thing we all do when we're uncomfortable and want a familiar anchor. It's not there. Obviously, it's not there. But the absence feels wrong, disorienting. There is no time here. Not because clocks haven't been invented. That's obvious enough. But because time moves differently when every single thing you own, every object you use, every piece of clothing on your body must be made by hand. By your hand, or by the hands of someone you know, someone you can see working, day after day after day. A woman sits nearby, maybe 30 feet down the slope, and a spot where the hillside flattens just enough to make sitting possible. She's older, though age is hard to judge when everyone's skin is weathered by sun and wind and altitude. Her hands move in a rhythm that seems almost meditative, twisting fibers between her fingers, pulling, twisting again. She's been doing this for hours. She'll do it for several more hours tomorrow. She'll do it again. And the day after that, this isn't unusual. This is just life. You're in the Andes around 3000 BCE. Agriculture is relatively new, still being figured out through trial and error that costs lives when the errors are bad enough. Cities are centuries away from existing, writing, not even a concept yet. The wheel, never going to happen here. Not because people aren't smart enough, but because wheels are useless on mountains this steep, and yet someone, probably a woman whose name we'll never know, whose face we'll never see, whose thoughts we'll never hear, is sitting on this mountainside staring at plant fibers and thinking, what if I twisted these together? What if I made them stronger? What if I made them into something? This is where it starts, not with a dramatic discovery or a sudden innovation, but with someone being cold and deciding to do something about it. Very, very slowly. Before looms, before tools, before any kind of technology at all, there was only patience. Not the modern kind of patience, that annoying feeling you get waiting for your coffee order or for a website to load, but ancient patience, the kind that understood, bone deep, that making a single piece of cloth might take months, and that wasn't a problem to be solved. It was just the way things were, normal, expected, the price of not freezing to death. The first textiles weren't woven. They were twisted. Imagine taking dried grass or the inner fibers of certain plants or wool pulled from a llama that probably didn't appreciate the process and just twisting it between your fingers over and over for hours, for days, until eventually, slowly, you have something that resembles string. Not good string, not even particularly useful string, but string nonetheless, a fiber longer and stronger than any single plant could produce. Then you take this string, this laboriously created string that represents hours of finger-twisting tedium, and you start connecting pieces of it over, under, no loom, no tools, just your fingers and whatever you can tie the ends to. A couple of sticks maybe, or your own toes. Archaeological evidence suggests that yes, people used their toes to hold tension while finger weaving, because when you don't have equipment, your body becomes the equipment. Picture it. You're sitting on cold ground, possibly for the entire day. Your back aches because ergonomic seating hasn't been invented and won't be for several thousand years. Your fingers are going numb because it's always cold at this altitude. And you're working with fibers that are slightly damp, which makes them easier to work with, but also makes your hands even colder. You're weaving over, under, pull tight, over, under, pull tight. A rhythm so simple that a child could learn it, but so repetitive that it requires a kind of mental endurance that most modern people simply don't possess anymore. This isn't craft. Not yet. This isn't art or self-expression or creative fulfillment. This is survival with extra steps. Very, very extra steps. Because if you don't make this cloth, you don't have clothes. And if you don't have clothes, the next time winter comes, and winter always comes in the mountains, you might not survive it. Motivation doesn't get more fundamental than that. Imagine sitting on a cold mountainside, wind biting your face, fingers going numb, and you're weaving, not because you want to, not because it's fulfilling or meditative or any of those words we use now to make tedious activities sound meaningful, because if you don't, you'll freeze to death next winter, you or your children or your parents. Someone you love will suffer because you didn't spend enough hours doing this mind-numbing, finger-numbing, soul-numbing, repetitive motion. In our world, we complain when Netflix buffers for 3 seconds. We get impatient when our food delivery takes 40 minutes instead of 30. We feel that little spike of annoyance when we have to wait in line at the coffee shop. These people spent 6 months making a shirt, 6 months, and then they wore it until it literally disintegrated, fell apart, thread by thread, because starting over meant another 6 months of this, another 6 months of frozen fingers and aching backs, and the same motion repeated until your mind goes somewhere else entirely just to cope with the monotony. But somewhere in this tedium, something happened. Someone, and again, we'll never know who, noticed something. If you twist plant fibers while pulling them, really pulling them with consistent tension, they don't just hold together. They become something new, something stronger than the individual fibers had any right to be. The twist locks the fibers against each other, and suddenly you have thread, actual thread. Still not great thread, but thread that can support weight, that can be worked with, that can be turned into something useful. This discovery probably took generations because, unlike modern innovation, where someone has a eureka moment and rushes to patent their invention, ancient innovation was more like this. My grandmother showed my mother how to twist fibers slightly differently than her grandmother had shown her. My mother showed me that technique, and I noticed that if I pull a little harder while twisting, the thread comes out a bit stronger. Maybe I show my daughter that variation. Maybe she figures out that certain plants work better than others. Maybe her daughter discovers that if you wet the fibers first, they twist more easily. And maybe 3 generations later, we have something that actually resembles decent thread. No single inventor, no patent, no name recorded in history, just the slow collective accumulation of tiny improvements, each one barely noticeable, each one passed down through demonstration and practice and the muscle memory of hands that have done this motion 10,000 times. And then came the drop spindle. Now, calling this a major technological breakthrough might seem like an exaggeration. It's literally a stick with a weight on the bottom. That's it. That's the entire invention. A stick with a rock or a clay disc attached to one end. But this simple tool, this piece of Stone Age technology that a child could make in an afternoon, changed everything. Because now, instead of twisting fibers by hand, you could use gravity to do most of the work. You hold fibers in one hand. Give the spindle a twist with the other and let it drop. The weight at the bottom keeps it spinning. And as it spins, it twists the fibers into thread, continuously, consistently, without your fingers cramping up after an hour. It's still slow. It still takes forever, but it's less forever than before, which in the ancient world counted as revolutionary. This was cutting-edge technology, a stick with a rock on it that spins, and yet it legitimately changed everything, because now, instead of finger twisting for 6 months to make enough thread for a shirt, you could drop spindle for only 4 months. Progress, real, measurable progress. The kind where fewer of your children freeze to death, which is about as meaningful as progress gets. The women, and yes, it was almost always women doing this work. could now spin thread while walking, while watching children, while sitting around fires in the evening. The spindle could hang from the thread, spinning slowly while their hands did other things, multitasking, ancient style, not because they wanted to be productive in multiple areas simultaneously, but because there was simply too much work to do and not enough hours in the day to do it all sequentially. You watch this woman on the hillside, her drop spindle twirling lazily as she feeds fibers into the growing thread. She's not thinking about technological innovation or the evolution of textile production. She's probably thinking about whether there will be enough food to get through winter, or whether her daughter's cough is getting worse, or whether the llamas will produce enough wool this year. The profound and the mundane, mixed together in a mind that's half focused on the automatic motion of spinning and half focused on the thousands of other concerns that make up a life. And this is important to understand. This moment, this woman, this drop spindle lazily spinning on a mountainside, this is the foundation of an empire, not conquest, not warfare, not some brilliant leader with grand visions, just thread made slowly, patiently, by hands that understood that anything worth having takes time, lots and lots of time, because you're watching the birth of an empire, but it doesn't look like conquest or glory. It looks like an old woman sitting in a doorway, spinning thread, while llamas grace nearby, while children play, while absolutely nothing dramatic seems to be happening at all, but something is happening, very slowly. So slowly you could watch for hours and not see any change. But it's happening, thread by thread. The Inca are building, not buildings, not yet, not cities or roads or temples. They're building the fundamental technology that will make all of that possible. They're building cloth, and cloth in this world isn't just clothing. It's not just protection from cold. Cloth is labor made visible. It's hours and hours of human effort compressed into something you can hold, something you can trade, something that proves you or someone you know spent days or weeks or months creating value out of raw materials and patience. In a world without money, without writing, without any of the complex systems we use to track value and debt and obligation, cloth becomes all of those things. Cloth is currency. Cloth is status. Cloth is proof of worth. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in 3000 BCE, cloth is still mostly just protection from the cold. The complicated stuff comes later, much later, because everything in the story comes later. Slowly, building on what came before, generation after generation of tiny improvements that add up to something remarkable as the sun sets over the Andes, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and pink that would look fake if you saw them in a painting. You watched the woman carefully wrap her day's work, maybe 20 feet of thread, an entire day of work, and she has 20 feet of thread to show for it. Tomorrow she'll make another 20 feet. And the day after that, and eventually, weeks from now, she'll have enough thread to start making cloth. Actual cloth, which will take even longer. Your modern mind rebels against this pace. Surely there's a faster way. Surely someone could innovate, could improve the process, could speed things up. But speed isn't the goal here. Speed has never been the goal. The goal is to not die. The goal is to have clothes when winter comes. The goal is to take care of your family with the resources and knowledge available to you. And those resources are plants, animals, your own two hands. And time. Lots and lots of time. And perhaps that's the first lesson of INCA textiles. The foundation that everything else will build on. The people who master slowness, who can maintain focus and quality and consistency over not just hours or days, but months and years and generations. Those people will outlast everyone else. Those people will build something that endures. Not because they're stronger or smarter or more ambitious than anyone else, but because they understand something fundamental about the relationship between time and value. The Inca, or rather the people who would eventually become the Inca, because we're still thousands of years away from anything resembling an empire. These people are about to become masters of slowness, masters of patience, masters of the understanding that the things which last are not the things made quickly. They're the things made slowly, carefully, thread by thread, by hands that have done this motion so many times, it's become as automatic as breathing. As darkness falls over the mountains and the temperature drops toward freezing, and you find whatever shelter you can from the wind that never stops blowing, you realize something profound. You've spent an entire day watching someone make thread, just thread, not even cloth yet, just thread, and somehow, impossibly, it wasn't boring, or rather, it was boring, but in that meditative way where boring becomes something else, becomes peaceful, becomes a glimpse into a completely different way of experiencing time itself. Tomorrow, if you're still here, you'll watch her make more thread. And the day after that, and the day after that, because that's what life is here. Thread over, thread under, pull tight. Spin the spindle, let it drop. Watch it spin over and over, day after day, year after year, until your hands know the motion better than your mind does. Until you can spin thread in the dark by feel alone. Until the rhythm of it becomes as natural as your own heartbeat. This is where empire begins, in patience, in repetition, in the slow, steady accumulation of thread. Morning comes slowly to the Andes. The sun takes its time climbing over the eastern peaks. And even when it arrives, the cold remains. You spent the night in a stone shelter, huddled near a fire that someone tended through the dark hours. Because fires here aren't luxuries. They're the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Sleeping on stone does that. The people around you seem unbothered, going about their morning routines with the casual efficiency of those who've never known anything else. We're moving forward now, not quickly, because nothing about this story happens quickly, but forward nonetheless. Around 2000 BCE, somewhere in these mountains, someone invented the loom, and the world barely noticed. I mean that literally. The invention of the loom didn't make news, didn't spread rapidly, didn't cause any dramatic shift that archaeologists can point to and say, here, this is when everything changed. Because the loom didn't make weaving faster. It made it possible to make more complex patterns while still taking absolutely forever. This is the backstrap loom, and it's both simpler and more complicated than you might imagine. Picture this, 2 sticks, just 2 sticks. One stick gets tied to a tree, or a post, or anything solid and immovable. The other stick gets tied to a strap that goes around your back, around your waist. Thread stretches between the 2 sticks. That's it. That's the entire loom, 2 sticks and string. But here's the beautiful, terrible part. Your body becomes part of the machine. You are the loom. The loom is you. Lean forward. The tension loosens. Lean back, the tension tightens. Want to adjust how tight the weave is. Shift your body weight. Want to work on a different section. Move your entire torso. You're not using a tool. You're merging with a tool. It's part machine, part meditation, part slow torture that will leave your back aching for days, but will eventually produce cloth. This is the INCA version of standing desks. You know those modern standing desks that office workers use? Convinced that standing while working is somehow better for you than sitting. The backstrap loom is that, but ancient. Now you can have back pain while making cloth. Instead of just having numb fingers. Progress, genuine, measurable progress. The kind that makes life harder in some ways and more productive in others. And you're not entirely sure if the trade-off is worth it. But there's no going back now, because everyone else is using the new technology. And if you don't adopt it too, you'll fall behind. Let's talk about what it actually takes to use a backstrap loom. Because the details matter here. The slowness matters. The methodical nature of every single step matters. This isn't something you can rush. This isn't something where cutting corners saves time. Every shortcut, every moment of impatience shows up in the final cloth as a flaw, a weakness, a place where threads aren't quite right. First, you prepare the warp threads. These are the vertical threads, the foundation of everything. You need to measure them, not with a ruler, because those don't exist in any useful form. You measure with your arms, stretch them wide, fingertip to fingertip. That's 1 unit of measurement. You'll do this roughly 200 times for a piece of cloth large enough to be useful. 200 times, arms stretched wide, measuring invisible future cloth in units of your own body. This takes all morning. Just the measuring, just stretching your arms and counting and trying not to lose track of which number you're on. There's no way to write it down. So you have to keep count in your head, or use small stones as markers, or develop some other system for remembering where you are in a process that must be precise but has no tools for precision beyond your own attention and memory. Then you tie these threads to the loom sticks, both ends. Every single thread must be tied individually, and every single knot must have exactly the same tension, not approximately the same. Exactly the same. Because if one thread is tighter than the others, it will pull the whole cloth out of alignment. If one is looser, it will create a gap. You learn to test tension by feel, running the threads through your fingers, plucking them like an instrument, listening to or feeling for the subtle differences that indicate whether a thread needs to be tightened or loosened by the tiniest amount. This takes hours. Tying 200 knots takes maybe an hour if you're fast. Tying 200 knots that are all exactly the same tension takes 5 or 6 hours, even for someone who's been doing this their entire life. Your fingers cramp. Your eyes strain from focusing on the same repetitive motion. Your mind wanders and you have to pull it back, because one moment of inattention means you might tie a knot wrong and not notice until hours later, when the whole thing has to be undone and redone. Now, you attach one stick to a tree. This sounds simple. It takes an hour because the stick must be at exactly the right height. Not sort of right. Exactly right. Too high and you'll be stretching uncomfortably all day. Too low and you'll be hunched over. Destroying your back just right. And you can work for hours in something approximating comfort, though comfort is a relative term when you're tied to a loom. The tension must be perfect. Too tight and threads will snap as you work. Too loose and the cloth will come out wavy and irregular. Just right. And you've spent 60 minutes tying a stick to a tree with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. Because in a way, You are a bomb of wasted time. If you get this wrong, everything that comes after will be wrong. And you won't know it until you've invested days of work into cloth that comes out unusable. Then you tie the other stick to a strap that goes around your waist. This also requires perfect tension, but it's adjustable, which is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because you can fine-tune as you work. A curse because you'll need to constantly fine-tune as you work, making tiny adjustments with your body position, leaning forward or back by inches, feeling for that perfect tension that makes the threads sing silently as you pass the weft through them. And now, finally, after an entire day of preparation, after all these hours of measuring and tying and adjusting, you can begin the actual weaving, the exciting part. Thread goes over, thread goes under. You pull a stick called a beater, a heddle rod, through to create a shed, a space where the weft thread can pass through. You pass the weft thread through this space. You beat it down tight against the previous row with another stick, packing the threads together so there are no gaps. You switch the shed, opening a different space in the warp threads. You pass the weft through again. You beat it down again. Repeat again and again and again. You will do this motion approximately 40,000 times to make one small piece of cloth. The INCA didn't count. They didn't need to count. They just kept going. Thread over, thread under, beat, thread over, thread under, beat, until their eyes glazed over and time became meaningless, until the motion was so automatic that they could do it while thinking about other things, while having conversations, while their minds went somewhere else entirely, just to cope with the mind-numbing repetition of the task. This is the original mindfulness meditation. Except instead of achieving enlightenment, you achieve really, really good rectangles. Cloth rectangles. Useful rectangles that keep people from freezing, but rectangles nonetheless. And you achieve them so slowly that modern people watching this process would give up after 10 minutes and just buy something made in a factory by machines that can do in seconds what takes you hours. But here's the thing. There are no factories. There are no machines. There are no shortcuts. There's only this. Thread over, thread under. Beat, thread over, thread under. Beat day after day after day until you have cloth, and then you start again. Because everyone needs cloth. Your family needs it. Your community needs it. Eventually, when the Inca Empire rises, the empire itself will need it, will demand it, will measure your worth as a citizen by how much cloth you can produce. You're sitting now, or rather you're kneeling, with the backstrap loom stretching out in front of you, the strap tight around your waist. The woman next to you, the one who was spinning thread yesterday, is now weaving. Her hands move with a rhythm that seems almost mechanical in its consistency. Thread through the shed, beat it down, change the shed, thread through again. Over and over. She doesn't look at what she's doing. Her hands know. They've done this motion 10,000 times before. Maybe 100,000 times. The muscle memory is so deep that thinking about it would probably make her slower. She's not alone. All around. Women are weaving in doorways, in shelters, out in the open when the weather permits. The sound of weaving, that soft, rhythmic beat as the beater packs threads tight. That's the soundtrack of life here. It's as constant as wind, as inevitable as sunrise. This is what women do, not occasionally, not as a hobby, but as the primary definition of adult female existence. In INCA society, every woman wove not as artistic expression or creative outlet, as duty, as identity, as the very definition of being female. If you were a woman and you didn't weave, you weren't fulfilling your role in society. You weren't pulling your weight. You were, in the most fundamental sense, failing to be what a woman was supposed to be. Girls learned to spin before they could walk properly. By age 5, they could produce thread finer than modern sewing thread. Their small fingers nimble and precise in ways that adult fingers often couldn't match. By age 10, they could weave complex patterns while having conversations, watching younger children, and probably solving mathematical equations in their heads. Because the Inca were sophisticated with numbers, even if they never developed writing, the weaving itself became social time. Women worked together, not in silence, but in conversation. Gossip, news, songs, stories, all flowing as constantly as the thread through their fingers. The work was so automatic that it didn't require conscious thought. Your hands could weave while your mind did other things. Planned meals, worried about children, remembered loved ones who had died, dreamed about futures that might never come. The repetitive motion of weaving created a space where the mind could wander, protected by the simple physical rhythm of the work. But it wasn't just personal production. The Inca Empire demanded tribute in cloth, not gold, not food, not animals, cloth. Because cloth was currency. Cloth was labor made visible. Cloth was proof that you were a productive member of society, that you contributed to the empire's wealth and power. Every household had to produce a certain amount of cloth every year as tax, not sell it and pay money. Produce it directly. Hand it over to imperial administrators who would distribute it to the army, to state workers, to anyone the empire needed to pay or reward or clothe. Imagine if the IRS required you to submit 20 hand-woven tapestries per year, not the money to buy tapestries. The actual tapestries, made by your hands, proof of your labor. That was normal life in the Inca Empire. That was just what citizens did. They wove for themselves, and they wove for the state. And there was no question about whether this was fair or reasonable. It simply was. And here's where it gets even more interesting. If you can call something this slow and methodical interesting, the type of cloth you wore, the patterns in it, the quality of the fiber, all of this communicated information. It was a language without words, a complex system of visual communication that everyone understood instantly. Commoners wore plain alpaca wool, decent quality, warm enough, but unadorned. No fancy patterns, no special dyes, just the natural brown or white or gray of alpaca fiber woven into serviceable cloth. You could look at someone wearing this and know immediately that they were ordinary people. Farmers or herders or craft workers, respectable, but not important. Nobles wore fine llama wool with patterns woven in. The patterns themselves conveyed information. Which region you were from, which clan you belonged to, what your specific role in the nobility was. A trained eye could look at someone's tunic and know their entire social position, where they came from, who their family was, what responsibilities they held. The cloth was a resume, an ID card, a family tree, all woven into geometric designs that took months to create. Royalty wore vicuña wool, the softest, finest fiber known in the Andes. Vicuñas are wild relatives of llamas, smaller and more delicate, and their fiber is so fine that it makes cashmere feel coarse by comparison. But vicuñas can only be shorn every few years, and catching them is difficult. And the amount of fiber you get from one animal is tiny. A single royal tunic might require the wool from dozens of vicuñas, representing not just months of weaving, but months of hunting, catching, carefully shearing without harming the animals, and processing fiber so delicate that it takes extraordinary skill to work with it all. And the emperor, the Sapa Inca himself, wore cloth woven by the Aciella. The chosen women, these were girls selected at age 10 or so, taken from their families and placed in special houses where they did nothing but weave for the rest of their lives. They didn't marry, didn't have children, didn't do anything except weave the finest cloth humanly possible for the emperor, for the gods, for the most sacred purposes the empire could conceive. The cloth these women produced was so fine that Spanish conquistadors, when they first saw it, thought it must be silk. It wasn't. It was alpaca wool, or vicuña, woven with such skill and such fine thread that it had a sheen and softness that Europeans had only ever seen in silk imported from China at enormous expense. Except this wasn't imported. This was made right here by teenagers, using stone tools and natural dyes and looms, not much more sophisticated than the one you're watching right now. The Inca didn't have writing, but they had at least 50 different words for types of cloth. They couldn't write down laws, but they could look at your poncho and know your entire life story. They couldn't record history in books, but they wove history into textiles that would last for centuries, that would survive burial in tombs, that would tell stories long after everyone who knew those stories was dead. You watch the weaving continue through the afternoon. Thread over, thread under, beat. Thread over, thread under, beat. The rhythm is hypnotic. You find yourself counting along unconsciously. 1, 2, 3, 4. How many beats, how many threads, doesn't matter. The number is too large to be meaningful. What matters is the rhythm, the consistency, the never-ending repetition that gradually, so gradually you can barely perceive it, produces something real, something useful, something that will keep someone warm. As the sun begins its long slide toward the western peaks, you realize something profound. Time here isn't measured in hours or minutes. It's measured in cloth. How long until the harvest festival? About 3 weavings. When is the next big ceremony after the royal cloth is finished? When can we travel to the next valley once the new tunics are completed? The entire society runs on the speed of weaving, which is to say, it runs very, very slowly. And that's not a problem. That's just reality. Modern people seek mindfulness through apps, through yoga classes, through expensive retreats where you pay hundreds of dollars to learn how to be present in the moment. The Inca achieved it through sheer repetitive tedium. Thread over, thread under. Beat, thread over, thread under. Beat. Do this for 8 hours a day, every day, for your entire life. And you either go insane or achieve a state of Zen that makes Buddhist monks look fidgety. And judging by the calm expressions on the faces of the women around you, they've found something close to that Zen. Not happiness, exactly, not joy, but a kind of peaceful acceptance of the endless repetition that defines their lives. The backstrap loom wasn't a revolution in the dramatic sense. It didn't suddenly make everything better. It didn't transform society overnight. What it did was make complexity possible before the backstrap loom. Cloth was simple, functional. After the backstrap loom, cloth could carry information, could display patterns, could show status and identity and belonging. The loom made cloth into language, into currency, into art. But it did all of this slowly, so slowly that no single generation would have noticed the change. Just gradual improvement, each generation adding tiny innovations, until eventually you had something remarkable. And here's the deeper truth about the backstrap loom, the thing that makes it more than just a tool. It made weaving portable. You could set it up anywhere. A doorway, a hillside, inside a shelter when the weather turned bad. You weren't tied to a specific location like you would be with a larger, more permanent loom. This meant that weaving could happen everywhere, all the time. Women traveling with herds could weave. Women working in fields could take breaks to weave. Every spare moment could be turned into cloth, into value, into the slow accumulation of wealth measured not in gold or silver, but in thread count and pattern complexity. The Inca built an empire not because they moved fast, but because they never stopped moving. Thread over, thread under, beat, thread over, thread under, beat. While other civilizations rose and fell in dramatic fashion, full of wars and revolutions and sudden changes, the Inca just kept weaving year by year, generation by generation, building an empire not through conquest, not yet, but through the steady accumulation of skill, of cloth, of the patient understanding that anything worth building takes time. As evening settles over the mountains and the temperature drops toward freezing once again, you watch the woman carefully remove the day's weaving from her backstrap loom, maybe 6 inches of progress, an entire day of work. And she has 6 inches of cloth to show for it. Tomorrow she'll add another 6 inches. And the day after that, and eventually, weeks from now, she'll have enough cloth for a tunic, or a carrying cloth, or whatever she's making. And then she'll start again, because the work is never finished. The need for cloth is never satisfied. There's always more spinning to do, more weaving to do, more thread to create, and more patterns to execute. Your back aches from watching, from sitting still for so long, from the altitude and the cold and the sheer mental endurance of observing something so repetitive for so many hours. But there's also something peaceful about it, something that quiets the constant chatter of modern anxiety. Thread over, thread under, beat. It's simple, it's clear. It produces visible results, even if those results come slowly. There's no ambiguity, no uncertainty, just the work and the patience to keep doing it. And as you drift toward sleep, the sound of night wind whistling through the mountains, you understand something fundamental about the Inca that you didn't understand before. They didn't build their empire through brilliance or sudden innovation or dramatic leaps forward. They built it through patience, through the willingness to do the same motion 40,000 times if that's what it took to make something good, through the deep understanding that time, massive amounts of time, properly applied to consistent effort could create anything, even an empire. The morning air carries a different quality today. Perhaps it's just your imagination. But there seems to be a sense of anticipation in the settlement. People move with purpose, though not with haste. Haste is never part of life here. But purpose, yes. Something important is about to happen, or is already happening. Somewhere in the compound of buildings that has grown more substantial since you first arrived. Stone walls now, not just shelters. Storage buildings, spaces dedicated to specific purposes. This isn't just a village anymore. It's becoming something more organized, something more permanent. We're moving forward in time again to around 1000 CE, when the Inca made a crucial decision about their relationship with cloth. What if, they asked themselves, what if we made weaving even slower, even more demanding, even more difficult? But in exchange, we produced cloth so perfect it could honor the gods. What if we created textiles so fine, so flawless, so impossibly beautiful that they transcended utility and became offerings worthy of the divine? This question led to the vertical loom and to a transformation of weaving from craft into something approaching religion. The vertical loom stands upright like a frame, like a doorway to nowhere. 2 vertical posts, firmly anchored in the ground or held in a wooden frame, with horizontal bars at top and bottom. The warp threads stretch between these bars, creating a surface that stands before the weaver like a blank canvas before a painter. Except this canvas will take months to fill. And every single mark on it must be perfect. Because perfection is the point. Perfection is the offering. This is technically an innovation. The vertical loom allows for larger pieces of cloth. It frees both hands to work simultaneously. It makes certain complex patterns easier to execute because you can see the entire piece at once. Can step back and check your work. Can approach weaving with the careful deliberation of someone painting a masterpiece rather than producing a commodity. But let's be clear about something. This is like upgrading from a bicycle to a slightly fancier bicycle that requires a friend to help you get on it. Progress, technically, but you're still essentially bicycling. You're still moving at the same fundamental pace, still counting your progress in threads per hour. And that number is still depressingly small. The vertical loom requires 2 people to set up. One person cannot tension the warp threads alone, cannot hold the frame steady while tying off the hundreds of threads that form the foundation of the work. This makes weaving more social in one sense, requiring cooperation and coordination, but it also makes it more demanding, more ceremonial. You don't just sit down and weave on a vertical loom the way you might on a backstrap loom. You prepare, you plan, you commit to a piece that might take 6 months or a year to complete. And once you begin, there's no easy way to stop and start. The vertical loom demands sustained attention, sustained presence, sustained devotion to the work. And devotion is the right word. Because around this same time, the Inca established the Aquela, the chosen women. This requires us to talk about something complex, something that doesn't fit neatly into modern categories of good or bad, oppression or honor. The Aquela were girls, usually around 10 years old, selected from across the empire for their beauty, their perfect health, their skill with fiber and thread, selected by imperial officials who traveled from village to village, looking for the most promising young weavers. These girls were taken from their families permanently. They were brought to special compounds called Aclahuasi, houses of the chosen women, where they would spend the rest of their lives. They would never marry. They would never have children. They would never return home. They would weave. That's what they would do. They would weave cloth for the emperor, for the gods, for the most sacred purposes the empire could conceive. And this wasn't punishment. This was honor. This was being chosen for something greater than ordinary life. Or at least, that's how it was framed. That's how the empire sold it to families who had to give up their daughters. Probably forever. The girls lived in compounds that were part convent, part workshop, part prison. They were guarded, always not to keep them in, though that was certainly part of it, but to keep others out. These were sacred women, dedicated to sacred purposes. Their virginity was essential, not in some abstract moral sense, but because the cloth they wove was an offering, and offerings had to be pure. The weavers had to be pure. Everything about the process had to be unblemished, perfect, suitable for presentation to gods and emperors who would accept nothing less than perfection. And they wove textiles so fine that when Spanish conquistadors first saw them, they refused to believe they were made from animal fiber. This must be silk. They insisted only silk could be this soft, this fine, this impossibly smooth against the skin. But it wasn't silk. It was alpaca wool, or vicuña, processed and spun and woven with such skill that it transcended what anyone thought animal fiber could be. Let's talk about what that actually means. What it means to weave thread so fine that it approaches the limits of what human hands and eyes can work with. Modern luxury bed sheets, the kind that cost hundreds of dollars and come with all sorts of marketing about Egyptian cotton and thread count. These typically have about 600 threads per inch. That's considered extremely high quality. That's what we think of as the pinnacle of textile luxury in our machine-made world. INCA sacred textiles had 600 threads per inch, in both directions, warp and weft, creating a fabric so dense, so tight, so perfect that it was nearly waterproof from sheer thread density alone. And this was done by teenage girls with stone tools, with natural dyes made from insects and plants and minerals, with no magnifying glasses to help them see the threads, no electric lights to illuminate their work, just perfect eyesight, perfect hands, and the acceptance that this one piece of cloth will take 6 months to complete, minimum, maybe a year, maybe longer if the pattern is particularly complex. Imagine this. It's hour one of a project that will consume the next 6 months of your life. You select the warp threads. Each one must be identical in thickness, not similar. Identical. You test them by feel, rolling them between your fingers, comparing them to a standard that exists only in your muscle memory and your highly trained sense of touch. 200 threads, all identical. Any thread that's even slightly wrong goes back into the pile of raw fiber to be respun. This takes all morning. Just the selection process. Just making sure your foundation is perfect before you even begin. Hour two, you tie these threads to the loom frame. Every knot must be exactly the same tension. You've done this thousands of times before. Your hands know the motion, but you still check each one, plucking the threads like harp strings, listening for the tone that indicates proper tension. Too tight, and it will snap under the stress of weaving. Too loose, and the cloth will be uneven. Just right. And it makes a sound, in your bones. A pitch you've internalized through years of training. Hour three, you begin the actual weaving. The first row takes 45 minutes. This cloth will have 400 rows when it's finished. 400 rows. each taking between 30 minutes and an hour depending on the complexity of the pattern. You do the math. That's 200 to 400 hours of actual weaving time. And that doesn't count the preparation, the planning, the selection of dyes, the creation of the pattern, the meditation and prayer that accompanies sacred work, hours 4 through 2000. Repeat, thread through the shed, beat it down with a spacing tool that ensures every thread is exactly the same distance from its neighbors. Change the shed. Thread through again, beat it down. Your eyes strain from the close work. Your back aches from standing, because the vertical loom requires you to stand, requires full body engagement with the work. Your fingers develop calluses in specific spots where the thread passes through them thousands of times. But you don't stop. Stopping would be an insult to the gods, a failure of duty, a betrayal of the empire that has honored you by choosing you for this work. The patterns these women wove were called tokapu, geometric designs of extraordinary complexity, arranged in grids and sequences that modern scholars still argue about. Were they a form of writing, a visual language that encoded information about the wearer's status, lineage, achievements, or were they simply decorative? Beautiful for beauty's sake, patterns chosen for aesthetic reasons rather than communicative ones. The Inca aren't around to clarify. They were too busy weaving to invent a way to explain weaving. They wove information rather than writing it. But they didn't leave us a key to decode what that information meant. Some tokapu appear on royal tunics, each square a different pattern, arranged in a grid that might represent a calendar, or a genealogy, or a list of conquered territories, or something else entirely. The same basic designs appear across the empire, suggesting they had standardized meanings that everyone understood, but that understanding died with the people who held it. Now we have the textiles, perfect after 500 years in tombs, and we can describe the patterns in detail. We can count the threads, measure the spacing, analyze the dyes, but we cannot read them. We can see the language, but we cannot speak it. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the very act of weaving was the point. Not the communication, the process. Not the product. The thousands of hours of meditative, repetitive motion that created a state of consciousness somewhere between waking and dreaming. The rhythm of weaving as prayer. Each thread a devotion. Each row a meditation on perfection and impermanence. Because here's something the Inca did that seems insane to modern minds. They took their finest cloth, the pieces that took years to make, the textiles that represented the absolute pinnacle of human skill and patience and artistic achievement, and they burned them on purpose. As offerings to the gods, imagine spending 18 months weaving a tapestry finer than anything you will ever create again. Imagine the eye strain, the back pain, the thousands of hours of repetitive motion, the complete absorption in work that demands your full attention every single moment. Imagine finally finishing this piece, stepping back, seeing it complete for the first time. The pattern's perfect, the colors glowing, the texture so fine that light seems to pass through it rather than reflect off it. And then imagine watching a priest light it on fire while chanting blessings to the sun god. This wasn't waste. This was devotion. This was understanding that the gods demanded the best, and the best took time. Time was the most valuable thing anyone could offer. Not the product of time. Time itself, the irreplaceable, irretrievable hours of a human life, focused with complete attention on creating something perfect for a moment, before returning it to the gods through flame. The Spanish, when they learned about this practice, thought the Inca were primitive, wasteful, foolish. All that work destroyed, all that value gone up in smoke. But they missed the point. The value wasn't in the cloth. The value was in the making. The cloth was just evidence that the making had occurred. Burning it was proof that the offering was genuine, that you weren't holding back, that you were giving everything, even the irreplaceable. This philosophy extended to other forms of sacrifice as well. We need to talk about the capasocha ceremonies because they're part of the textile story, even though they're difficult to discuss. The Inca practiced child sacrifice, not frequently, not casually, but as part of the most important religious ceremonies, children were chosen, usually from noble families, usually children who were considered perfect in some way, beautiful, healthy, intelligent, and they were dressed in layers upon layers of the finest woven garments ever created. Sometimes a dozen separate garments, tunics, mantles, belts, bags, all woven with the finest thread, the most complex patterns, the most vibrant dyes, each garment taking months to make. The children were essentially wearing years of accumulated weaving, years of human labor and skill and devotion, wrapped around their small bodies in preparation for the journey to the mountaintop where they would be left as offerings to the gods. The Spanish found these mummies centuries later, preserved by the cold and dry air of the high peaks. The children were gone, had been dead for 500 years, but the textiles looked new, perfect, unchanged. The weaving had achieved a kind of immortality that the children themselves had not, and perhaps that was the point, not the child's life. Tragic as that loss was, but the cumulative hours of weaving that adorned them, thousands of human hours, thread by thread, transformed into something that would last long after everyone involved, weaver and child and priest, had returned to dust. Modern fast fashion produces a shirt in 3 minutes. Machines cut fabric. Machines sew seams. Machines add buttons and tags and fold the finished product into plastic bags. The shirt costs $5. It's worn twice, maybe 3 times, and then discarded when it goes out of style or shrinks in the wash, or simply because the wearer is bored with it. 3 minutes to make. 3 wears. Then landfill. Inca sacred textiles took 3 months to make. Minimum, they were worn once, maybe never worn at all. They were burned, offered to gods, buried with the dead. Different priorities, different understanding of what cloth means, what time means, what value itself means. In a world where everything must be made by hand, where every object represents hours or days or months of human labor, you don't develop a casual relationship with possessions. You don't throw things away. You use them until they disintegrate. And even then, you might repurpose the fragments for something else. Waste isn't just economically foolish. It's spiritually wrong. It's an insult to the time that was invested in creation. The women working at the vertical looms understood this in their bones. Every thread they placed was permanent. There was no undo button, no way to easily remove work that didn't meet their standards. If you made a mistake, you had 2 choices. Live with it. Incorporate it into the design somehow, or cut out entire sections of work and start over. Hours of work gone. Days, possibly. The pressure to get it right the first time, every time, was immense. And yet they did it for years, for decades, for their entire adult lives. They stood at vertical looms, placing threads with a precision that modern machines would struggle to match, creating textiles that have survived 500 years in tombs and still look perfect. Standing at a vertical loom for 8 hours a day destroys your body. Your back aches from the posture required to work at the center of a large piece while still being able to see the edges for pattern consistency. Your legs tremble from standing still for so long. Your eyes water from the close focus required to place threads that are nearly invisible individually. And you keep weaving, not because you enjoy it necessarily, not because you find it fulfilling in some abstract sense, because to stop would be to dishonor not just the gods, not just the emperor, but the thousands of weavers before you who stood in this exact spot, feeling this exact pain, making this exact motion. Thread over, thread under, beat, thread over, thread under, beat. The rhythm becomes your heartbeat, your breath, your existence. You are not a person who weaves. You are weaving that happens to occur in a human-shaped vessel. The distinction between self and work dissolves. There is no you in the cloth. There is only the process, the endless placement of threads, the gradual accumulation of pattern and texture and beauty that emerges from thousands of hours of focused attention. This is what the vertical loom made possible. Not faster weaving, not easier weaving, but weaving as spiritual practice, weaving as meditation, weaving as a form of prayer that required no words, just the patient repetition of motion until the motion itself became sacred, until the cloth produced was not just clothing or decoration, but a physical manifestation of human devotion, human patience, human willingness to spend years creating something perfect for a moment before letting it go. The Inca understood something that modern culture has mostly forgotten. Speed is easy. Anyone can rush through work, can cut corners, can produce quantity over quality. Perfection is hard. Perfection requires time. Not just time, but sustained attention over that time. The discipline to maintain focus not for minutes or hours, but for months, for years, and perfection sustained by an entire society, generation after generation, passing down skills and standards and expectations becomes something more than craft. It becomes identity. It becomes the foundation of civilization itself. As evening descends and the weavers finally step away from their vertical looms, carefully covering the unfinished work to protect it from dust and moisture overnight, you realize how sore you are from simply watching. Your back hurts from standing. Your eyes are tired from focusing on the close work. And you've done nothing except observe. The women who've been working all day move with the stiff, careful motions of people whose bodies hurt but who have long since learned to work through pain. This is normal. This is what weaving means. This is the price of perfection. You watch one of the younger women, maybe 16 or 17, step back from her loom and examine the day's work, maybe 8 inches of progress, an entire day of standing, of placing threads with precision that would make a surgeon jealous. And she has 8 inches to show for it. She doesn't look frustrated or disappointed. She looks satisfied. The work is good. The pattern is emerging correctly. In another 4 months, this piece will be finished. And then she'll start another piece. And then another for the rest of her life. She will stand at this loom or one like it, creating perfection slowly, patiently, thread by thread, and as you drift toward sleep, exhausted by the altitude and the mental endurance required to watch something so methodical for so long, you understand something fundamental about the Inca that changes how you see everything that came before and everything that will come after. They didn't weave quickly. They wove forever. And in that endless repetition, in that absolute commitment to craft, even when craft meant sacrificing years of life to create something that would be destroyed or buried or worn until it dissolved, they found meaning. They found identity. They found a way to make the temporary sacred by refusing to let it be casual, by insisting that everything made by human hands deserved the full attention of the human mind, the full devotion of human time. The vertical loom didn't make weaving faster. It made weaving sacred, and in doing so, it transformed cloth from utility into offering, from commodity into art, from the work of hands into the devotion of souls. Thread over, thread under, beat, thread over, thread under, beat, forever. Until the work is done, until perfection is achieved, until the gods themselves acknowledge that, yes, this offering is worthy. This sacrifice of time is accepted. Something strange happens as you watch the weavers work this morning. A man enters the compound, not dressed in the elaborate garments of nobility, but in a simple tunic that somehow communicates importance through subtle details you're only beginning to understand. He carries with him a bundle of strings, just strings, hanging from a main cord, knotted in various places, in various ways. He sits down with one of the elder women, and they begin to examine these strings together, running their fingers over the knots, nodding, occasionally pointing to specific sections. They're reading, you realize with a start that they're reading not words, not writing as you understand it, but something, information encoded in knots and colors and the positions of strings. Now we need to talk about the quipu. It's not exactly a loom. It's not exactly weaving, but it's made of thread, requires the same meditative patience, the same attention to minute detail, the same understanding that information can be encoded in fiber if you're patient enough to do the encoding and disciplined enough to do the decoding. The quipu might be the closest thing the Inca had to writing. Might be, nobody really knows for certain, which is absolutely perfect for boring history. A mystery that will never be completely solved, told through the medium of knotted string. What is a quipu? At the most basic level, it's a record-keeping system. A main cord, usually about as thick as your little finger, with anywhere from a few to several hundred strings hanging from it. These strings, called pendant cords, are knotted in specific ways, at specific positions, in specific colors. The type of knot matters. The position along the string matters. The color of the string matters. How tightly the knot is tied matters. Everything matters. It's like if Excel spreadsheets were made of string, required a degree in anthropology to read, and also maybe contained poetry. We're not sure about the poetry part. Scholars fight about this. The Inca created a record-keeping system so complicated that even they needed specialists to read it. These specialists were called quipu kamayaks, which translates roughly as knot keepers or knot readers. Professional string examiners. Imagine your job being to stare at knotted cord and decode imperial tax records, census data, military supply inventories, and possibly historical narratives You thought your job was boring. These people made careers out of reading knots. And it was important work, essential work, the kind of work that kept an empire functioning across thousands of miles of difficult terrain with no written language. No paper, nothing but string and memory and the patient transmission of knowledge from one generation of knot readers to the next. We think, and this is still debated among scholars who have devoted their entire careers to understanding quipus. We think that knots represented numbers. The position of a knot along a string indicated its place value. Ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. A knot at the bottom of a string means units. A knot higher up means tens, higher still, hundreds. Simple enough. Right. Except there were at least 24 different types of knots, each meaning something different. Single knots, long knots, figure 8 knots, E-knots, complex knots that required specific finger movements to create and specific training to recognize. These knots were arranged in specific positions on strings of specific colors. Red might mean soldiers. Yellow might mean gold. Brown might mean commoners. Or maybe red meant one type of maize. Yellow, another type of maize. And brown meant potatoes. We don't know. We know the system worked. We know the Inca used quipus to track a census of 12 million people across an empire stretching 2,500 miles from north to south. We know they recorded tribute payments, military supplies, historical events, and possibly laws and poetry and religious texts. But we don't have the key. We don't have the Rosetta Stone that would let us definitively decode what all these knots mean. The frustration of this cannot be overstated. Imagine if aliens destroyed every computer on Earth except for 600 calculators, and future archaeologists tried to reconstruct our entire civilization by analyzing calculator buttons. They could figure out that we understood mathematics. They could determine that we had a base 10 number system. But could they reconstruct Shakespeare from a calculator? Could they understand democracy or religion or the concept of love? That's where we are with quipus. We have the calculators. We're missing everything else. But let's talk about what we do know, because even the parts we understand are remarkable. The Inca Empire, at its height, governed 12 million people across terrain that ranged from coastal deserts to high-altitude plains to tropical rainforests. They maintained this empire without writing, without paper, without any of the bureaucratic tools that every other large-scale civilization in history has relied upon. They used string, knotted string, and it worked. It worked so well that when the Spanish arrived and destroyed the Inca administrative system, replacing it with European bureaucracy complete with written records and official documents, the colonial government was actually less efficient than what it replaced. Spanish administrators complained constantly about how difficult it was to track tribute payments, to conduct censuses, to maintain supply lines. The Inca had done all of this with string, and they'd done it better, more accurately, with less confusion and dispute, because the quipus weren't just records. They were proof, physical objects that could be examined, verified, compared against other quipus. You couldn't forge a quipu without someone noticing. The knots had to be tied in specific ways, with specific tensions. The colors had to match exactly. Any attempt to alter a knot would leave evidence, would change the texture of the string in ways that trained fingers could detect. The quipucamayaks, the knot readers, underwent years of training. They started young, usually children of existing quipucamayaks, learning through repetition and correction how to tie knots correctly, how to read knots quickly, how to memorize the meanings of colors and positions and combinations. This wasn't writing that anyone could learn. This was specialized knowledge, carefully guarded, passed down through families who maintained their position in society by maintaining their monopoly on information management. And here's where it connects back to weaving, where the thread that runs through this entire story becomes visible. The people who wove were the people who read quipus, not the same individuals necessarily. Weaving was primarily women's work, while quipu reading was primarily men's work. But the skill set was identical. The hand skills, the attention to detail, the tolerance for mind-numbing repetition, the comfort with the idea that a slight difference in tension or position or color changes everything. These were the same skills, just applied to different purposes. Girls learned to read patterns in cloth from the time they could focus their eyes. This design means noble family. This color combination means coastal region. This particular weave structure means ritual garment. They learned to encode information in textile form, to create cloth that communicated identity and status and origin to anyone who knew how to read it. Boys learned to read knots. This type of knot means 100 llamas. This color means maize. This position on the string means taxes paid in full. Same brain, different application. All string, all boring, all absolutely essential to making civilization function. The quipu makers, when they created these record-keeping devices, went through a process very similar to setting up a loom. First, you select the main cord. It must be strong, consistent in thickness, made from the finest thread you can produce. This cord is the foundation. Just like the warp threads in weaving, everything hangs from it. Literally, if it's weak or uneven, the entire quipu becomes unreliable. Then you create the pendant cords. These hang from the main cord, and there might be dozens of them, or hundreds. Depending on what you're recording, each cord must be exactly the right length. Too short, and you can't fit all the necessary knots. Too long, and the quipu becomes unwieldy. Difficult to read. You measure by body units, fingertip to elbow, full arm span. Whatever standardized measurement your particular quipu making tradition uses, the colors matter. So you dye the strings, natural dyes, the same ones used in weaving, cochineal insects for red, indigo for blue, various plants and minerals for yellows and browns and greens. Each color must be consistent within a quipu, must match the standard meaning for that color in your region, must be recognizable even in dim light or after years of storage. You dye many strings at once, keeping careful track of which dye bath they came from, because even slight variations in color can change meaning. Now comes the information encoding. You tie knots carefully at specific distances from the top of the pendant cord, using specific knot types with specific tensions. A number, let's say 347, might be encoded as a group of 3 knots in the hundreds position, 4 knots in the tens position, 7 knots in the ones position. Simple in concept, maddeningly complex in execution, because you must tie these knots identically every time. Must maintain perfect consistency. Must remember which position means which place value, which color means which category of goods or people or events. And you do this for hours, for days, creating a quipu that records a year's worth of tribute from a province or a census of a city, or the supplies needed for a military campaign. When you're finished, you have an object that weighs maybe a pound, contains hundreds or thousands of knots, and encodes information that would fill pages and pages if you tried to write it down. Except you don't write it down. You tie it up. You make information three-dimensional, tactile, something that can be read by touch in the dark if necessary. The beauty of this system, the thing that makes it elegant despite its complexity, is redundancy. Important information wasn't recorded on a single quipu. It was recorded on multiple quipos, held by different officials in different locations. If there was ever a dispute about tribute payments or census numbers, you could bring out the quipus and compare them. The knots don't lie. They can't be changed without leaving evidence. And if 3 different quipucamayaks in 3 different provinces all have quipus that agree on a number, that number becomes fact, becomes truth, becomes the official record that even the emperor cannot dispute. The quipucamayaks traveled with the Inca armies, maintaining records of supplies, casualties, prisoners. They accompanied tax collectors, recording tribute paid and owed. They worked in provincial capitals, maintaining censuses that tracked every person in their jurisdiction, and somewhere in Cusco, in the capital, there was an office, probably a very quiet office, a room where the empire's master, quipucamayaks, sat, comparing reports from across the realm, tying new quipus that synthesized information from hundreds of local quipus, maintaining the central records that let the emperor and his advisors know the state of the empire at any given moment. Inside this room, knots. Outside, war and conquest and the dramatic events that historians love to write about. But inside, just men sitting quietly, fingers moving over strings, tying knots, reading knots, recording the mundane details of imperial administration. How much maize was harvested in each valley? How many people lived in each city? How many llamas were available for sacrifice or transport? The boring, essential information that determines whether an empire thrives or collapses. Same level of importance as the generals and their battles. Maybe more important. Because you can win all the battles you want. But if you can't feed your army, you lose anyway. And here's the thing that makes quipus even more fascinating, even more connected to the larger story of Inca textiles. Some scholars think, that quipus might have contained more than just numbers. There are quipus that don't follow the numerical patterns. Quipus with unusual knot arrangements. Strange color sequences. Structures that don't make sense if you assume they're just accounting tools. These might be narrative quipus. Story quipus. Records of history or poetry or religious text encoded in a system we haven't yet deciphered. The Spanish chroniclers mention this. They write about quipucamayaks who could recite long historical narratives while consulting their quipus, telling stories of past emperors, great battles, migrations and founding myths. The chroniclers assumed these men had simply memorized the stories and were using the quipus as memory aids, as simple reminders of narrative sequences. But maybe not. Maybe the stories were actually encoded in the knots, readable by anyone with the right training, preserved in fiber rather than on paper or an oral tradition alone. We'll probably never know. When the Spanish conquered the Inca Empire, they saw quipus and thought, this is witchcraft. This is devil worship. These knotted strings must be tools of Satan. Because they're not writing. not Christian writing, not anything the Spanish can understand. So they burned them systematically, deliberately, centuries of records gone. The entire administrative history of an empire destroyed. Thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of quipus, thrown into fires by priests who thought they were fighting evil but were actually committing one of history's great acts of cultural erasure. Today, maybe 600 quipus survive, out of what must have been millions. 600. Stored in museums, analyzed by scholars using computers and microscopes and mathematical models. These researchers spend years staring at scans of knotted string, measuring knot positions down to the millimeter, cataloging color variations, looking for patterns, hoping for breakthrough moments that might let them read what the Inca wrote, or tied, whatever verb we should use for information encoded in knots. It's the most boring detective work imaginable. And also, maybe the most important, because somewhere in those knots is the voice of an empire we silenced before we could understand it. The Inca perspective on their own history, their laws, their poetry, their way of understanding the world. All of it encoded in a medium so alien to European thinking that we still, 500 years later, can't fully decode it. The connection between weaving and quipus goes beyond simple technical similarity. It represents a fundamental philosophical approach to information and memory. The Inca didn't trust the ephemeral spoken words disappear the moment they're uttered. Memories fade and distort over time. But fiber, properly prepared and maintained, lasts for centuries. Cloth survives burial. Knots remain tied. Information encoded in the physical world, in materials you can touch and see and verify. That information persists in ways that purely mental or oral information cannot. Modern culture has reversed this completely. We trust the ephemeral, the digital, information stored as magnetic patterns or electrical charges that will vanish the moment the power fails. We've traded physical permanence for convenient impermanence. The Inca made the opposite choice. They traded convenience for permanence. They accepted that encoding information in fiber was slow, required specialized training, demanded constant maintenance, but in exchange, they got records that could outlast civilizations. You watch the Quipucamayak and the weaver sitting together, comparing a quipu against a piece of cloth with geometric patterns. They're cross-referencing. You realize the quipu records numbers, quantities, census data. The textile records identity, status, origin. Together, they form a complete record of some administrative action, a tribute payment, maybe a census report, some intersection of numerical data and human identity that requires both string systems to fully capture. Neither the man nor the woman speaks much. Their fingers do the talking, moving over knots, tracing patterns in the textile, nodding in agreement or pointing to spots that need verification. This is how information moves in a society without writing, not through written correspondence or printed reports, but through physical objects carried by human messengers, compared and verified by trained specialists, preserved and maintained through careful storage and periodic review. It's slow, impossibly slow by modern standards, but it's also certain you can't hack a quipu. You can't edit someone's record without physical access to the string itself. And even then, your changes leave evidence. You can't forge a textile pattern without years of training in the specific weaving techniques of the region you're trying to impersonate. The very slowness and physicality of the system makes it secure in ways that faster, more convenient systems can never match. As the afternoon wears on and the Quipu Kamiak carefully packs away his bundle of knotted strings, preparing for the next stage of his journey through the province, you think about all the information systems humanity has invented, from cave paintings to cuneiform to alphabets to printing presses to computer code, each one faster than the last, each one more efficient, more convenient, capable of encoding more information in less space and less time, but also each one more fragile, more dependent on specialized tools and knowledge that can be lost, more vulnerable to environmental damage or technological obsolescence. The Quipu represents a different path, not faster, not more convenient, but potentially more durable, information encoded in a medium that requires nothing but human hands and human memory to create and decode. No computers, no electricity, no paper or ink, just string. String that can be produced anywhere, from plant fibers or animal wool, using techniques that haven't changed in thousands of years. String that lasts for centuries if properly stored. String that can encode complex information in forms that, once you know the system, are actually quite intuitive and physical, tactile, permanent. Thread doesn't last forever. Of course. Eventually it rots, breaks, disappears into the elements that created it. The Inca knew this. They made quippus anyway. They wove textiles anyway. Because the point wasn't permanent individual objects. The point was a permanent system. A way of encoding and preserving and transmitting information that could survive the loss of any individual quipu or textile. Because the knowledge of how to make and read them was distributed across thousands of trained specialists, passed down from generation to generation through demonstration and practice and the slow accumulation of expertise. As evening settles over the compound and you watch the weavers cover their looms and the Quipu disappear down the mountain path toward the next village on his circuit, you realize how tired your brain is, not from physical labor, from trying to understand a completely different way of organizing information and society, a way that doesn't privilege speed or convenience, but instead values consistency, verifiability, and the patient transmission of knowledge through human relationship rather than through written text. The Inca wove information rather than writing it. They tied information rather than printing it. And in doing so, they created systems that modern people struggle to even recognize as information systems because they look like craft supplies rather than like books or computers. But they worked. They worked well enough to administer an empire of 12 million people across incredibly diverse and difficult terrain. They worked well enough that the Spanish, even with all their written records and European bureaucratic systems, struggled to match the efficiency of what they destroyed. Maybe that's the real lesson of the Quipu, the thing that connects it most deeply to the larger story of Inca textiles. The tools don't matter as much as the patience to use them correctly. You can have the most advanced technology in the world, but if you're not willing to spend the time to master it, to use it carefully and consistently, to maintain the knowledge of how to use it across generations, it's useless. The Inca didn't have advanced technology. They had advanced patience, advanced consistency, advanced commitment to systems that worked, even when those systems were slow and demanding and required lifetimes of training to master. Thread by thread, knot by knot, They built an empire not on speed or innovation or dramatic leaps forward, but on the slow, steady application of human attention to materials that rewarded that attention with durability and reliability. In a world that values fast above all else, the Inca chose slow, chose careful, chose permanent. And for centuries, it worked until it met a culture that valued speed so much it destroyed what it couldn't understand quickly. But that's a story for tomorrow. For now, as sleep approaches and your mind finally releases its grip on these complex questions of information and memory and the relationship between time and value, you let yourself drift into the rhythm that has defined this entire journey. Thread over, thread under, beat, not tied, not read, meaning preserved, slowly, patiently, forever. The morning arrives with an unfamiliar sound, distant, metallic, wrong. You've grown accustomed to the sounds of the Andes over these weeks or months or however long you've been here. Time having lost its usual meaning in a place where days are measured in threads rather than hours. You know, the morning calls of birds, the bleating of llamas, the soft rhythmic beat of weavers at their looms. But this sound is different, sharper, more urgent. The sound of metal on metal, the sound of horses, animals that shouldn't be here, have never been here before. The sound of men shouting in a language that doesn't belong to these mountains. We're moving forward one last time to 1,532 after thousands of years of slow, methodical evolution, from finger weaving to backstrap looms to vertical looms to sacred textiles that could take years to complete. The Inca textile tradition is about to encounter something it has never faced before and is fundamentally unprepared to handle. Speed. European speed. Spanish speed. The speed of conquest, of disease, of forced conversion and cultural destruction. The speed that doesn't care about thread count. The Spanish arrived in Peru with horses, steel weapons, guns, and perhaps most devastatingly, diseases that the Inca had never encountered and had no immunity against. Within a few years, smallpox alone would kill perhaps half the population of the empire. But before the diseases did their worst work, before the full horror of conquest became clear, there was a moment, a brief window, where two completely different civilizations looked at each other and tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The Spanish saw wealth, gold, silver, emeralds. They saw an empire rich beyond imagination, and they wanted it. They noticed the gold on temple walls, the silver ornaments nobles wore, the precious stones embedded in ceremonial objects. What they didn't initially understand was that to the Inca, these things weren't the real wealth. The real wealth was cloth. The finest textiles were worth more than gold. A perfectly woven tunic could be more valuable than a room full of silver. But the Spanish couldn't see this. To them, cloth was cloth, functional, yes, but not valuable, not worth conquering an empire for. So they demanded gold. The famous ransom room, where the Inca filled a room with gold and twice over with silver, trying to ransom their captured emperor. The Spanish took it all, melted it down, destroyed objects of incredible artistry and cultural significance, turned them into bullion bars to ship back to Spain. And the Inca, watching this destruction, must have thought these invaders were insane. They're destroying objects that took master craftsmen months to create, objects that represent incredible skill and time and artistic vision. and they're turning them into generic metal, it would be like watching someone burn books to weigh the ashes. But the real destruction, the loss that would echo through centuries, came in. What happened to the textiles? The Spanish didn't want them. They had European wool, European looms, European tailoring traditions. These strange Andean textiles with their unfamiliar patterns and native styles held no interest, but worse. They represented paganism. They represented a pre-Christian culture that the Spanish church was determined to erase completely. Sacred textiles, the ones that had taken years to weave, that had been created by the Asiela, the chosen women, specifically as offerings to Inca gods. These were systematically collected and burned, not because they were worthless, but because they were too valuable, because they held religious significance that competed with Christianity, because allowing them to exist would be allowing Inca religion to persist. So priests gathered them up, these textiles that represented thousands of cumulative hours of human labor and skill, and set them on fire while preaching about salvation and the one true God. The Akla houses were emptied. These compounds, where girls had spent their entire lives weaving perfection, where they'd created textiles so fine that they seemed impossible, were shut down. The women were dispersed. Some went to convents, traded one form of cloistered life for another. Some were taken as wives or servants by Spanish conquistadors. Some simply disappeared from the historical record, their fates unknown, their names never recorded. The tradition they represented, the accumulated knowledge of generations, scattered like seeds in a windstorm. Some would take root in new forms. Much would simply be lost forever. The Quipas met an even worse fate, at least with textiles. The Spanish could recognize them as cloth, even if they didn't value them appropriately. Quipas, they couldn't understand at all. Knotted strings, what are these? Some kind of primitive accounting system, some form of witchcraft. The priests looked at Quipas and saw devil worship. They saw tools of Satan. They saw objects that needed to be destroyed immediately and completely before they could corrupt Christian souls. So they burned them, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. We'll never know the true number because the people doing the burning didn't keep careful records of what they were destroying. Why would they? They thought they were ridding the world of evil. They thought they were doing God's work. The fact that they were erasing the entire administrative, historical, and possibly literary record of a major civilization apparently didn't trouble them, or if it did, they decided that was acceptable collateral damage in the war for souls. Imagine the scene, a plaza somewhere in the Andes, Spanish priests in black robes, flanked by soldiers in steel armor. A pile of quipas, hundreds of them, representing decades or centuries of record keeping. They accumulated knowledge of Quipu Kamayaks who'd spent their entire lives learning to tie and read knots. Census records, tax records, historical narratives, poetry, religious texts, all of it about to become ash. They light the fire. The strings burn quickly. Cotton and wool consumed by flame in moments. The knots, those carefully tied knots that encoded so much information, blacken and disintegrate within an hour. Centuries of knowledge are gone. The Quipucamayaks watch. If they're allowed to watch, if they haven't already been killed or driven away, they watch their life's work burning. They watch their culture's memory burning, and they can do nothing. The men would steal swords and guns and horses, make sure of that. But here's what the Spanish didn't understand. Couldn't understand because they came from a culture where information lived in books rather than in human bodies. You can burn cloth. You can destroy quipus. You can kill weavers and quipucamayaks. But you cannot unweave muscle memory. You cannot burn the knowledge that lives in hands that have performed the same motions 10,000 times. You cannot erase the patterns that grandmothers teach granddaughters in quiet moments, showing them how to set up a loom, how to tension threads, how to read the cloth itself for information about technique and origin in the mountains, in the valleys that Spanish soldiers never quite managed to control completely. The old women kept weaving quietly, secretly, slowly, the way they always had. They couldn't make sacred textiles anymore. Not the way they used to. The akla system was gone. The ritual contexts were destroyed. The religious meanings were forbidden, but the techniques remained. The backstrap loom didn't care whether you were weaving for Inca gods or for Spanish masters or just for your own family. The techniques worked the same regardless. So they wove, and they taught their daughters to weave, and their daughters taught their daughters. Thread over, thread under, beat. Thread over, thread under, beat. The rhythm that had defined their culture for thousands of years didn't stop just because the empire fell. It continued. Get her now. Less grand, stripped of its religious significance and imperial importance. But it continued. The Spanish kept the tribute system because even they understood that Andean textiles were valuable, were necessary, were a form of currency that worked in this environment where European money didn't circulate effectively. But they changed everything else. European patterns instead of tokapu. Christian symbols instead of Inca religious designs, faster weaving, lower quality. Because the Spanish wanted quantity over perfection, cloth as commodity rather than as offering. Production speed more important than thread count. The weavers adapted. They had to. Refusing to adapt meant death, or slavery, or at best, marginalization and starvation. So they learned to weave what the Spanish wanted, but they also learned to hide, to embed secret symbols in Spanish-approved textiles. A condor disguised in a floral pattern, so subtle that Spanish overseers didn't notice it, but Andean eyes could recognize immediately. An Inca cross hidden in Christian iconography. The old beliefs encoded in the new required forms, colors arranged in sequences that meant something to those who knew the old language of cloth. The Spanish saw obedient production of colonial textiles. The weavers saw resistance, thread by thread, pattern by hidden pattern. They preserved what they could of the old ways while appearing to comply with the new order. It wasn't open rebellion. It wasn't dramatic resistance. It was slow, patient subversion through the same medium that had always been their strength. Cloth, thread, the patient accumulation of small acts of cultural preservation that, over centuries, would keep alive traditions the Spanish thought they'd destroyed. Over the generations that followed, something interesting happened. Spanish and Inca traditions merged, creating something new that was neither purely European nor purely Andean. European looms, the kind that stood on frames and allowed weavers to sit while they worked. These appeared in the Andes, but they were used with Andean techniques. Andean attention to thread quality and tension. Christian themes were woven in Inca styles. The patience and perfection that had characterized sacred Inca textiles now applied to representations of saints and biblical scenes. New fibers arrive with the Spanish sheep, which the Andes had never had before. Sheep wool is different from alpaca or llama wool. Coarser, but also more readily available. Easier to process in large quantities. Andean weavers learned to work with sheep wool, applying their traditional dyeing techniques, their traditional weaving methods to this new material. The result was textiles that were neither Spanish nor Inca, but something hybrid, something that carried both traditions in its threads. This is what survival looks like when survival means cultural adaptation rather than cultural purity. It's messy. It's complicated. It involves compromise and loss and the painful necessity of choosing what to preserve and what to let go. The weavers couldn't save everything. They couldn't maintain the eclat system. They couldn't weave sacred cloth for gods they were no longer allowed to worship publicly. They couldn't use the same patterns that had identified their clans and families under the Inca system. But they could weave, and as long as they could weave, they could preserve something, and they did. For 500 years, through colonial rule and wars of independence and modernization and globalization, through every change and challenge, the weaving continued. It changed. Yes, it adapted, certainly, but it never stopped. In some highland communities, women still use backstrapped looms, the same basic technology that was revolutionary 4,000 years ago. 2 sticks, thread stretched between them, the weaver's body providing tension. It works exactly the same way it always has. These women aren't using backstrap looms because they can't afford modern equipment, though many cannot. They use them because backstrap looms make different cloth with different tension, different hand, different connection between the body of the weaver and the threads she's working with. You cannot replicate this with a machine. You cannot buy it in factories. You can only make it the way it's always been made. Slowly, carefully, with your own body as part of the loom. The tourist markets of modern Peru are full of textiles, colorful, decorative, marketed as authentic Inca weaving. Most of them are made in factories in China, printed with vaguely Andean patterns, mass-produced and shipped in containers to be sold to tourists who don't know the difference. Some are made locally, but quickly, machine-woven or rapidly produced on modern looms. Approximations of traditional designs created in hours rather than months. And then there are the real ones. The textiles that actual weavers in actual highland villages make using actual traditional techniques. These take months. They're woven on backstrapped looms or small traditional vertical looms. They use natural dyes from plants and insects and minerals. They incorporate patterns that have meaning, that connect to specific communities and families and traditions. They're expensive, not because the weavers are greedy, but because $500 for 200 hours of work is $2.50 per hour, less than any minimum wage anywhere. But tourists often don't want to pay that much. They don't understand why a textile should cost more than the factory-made approximation that looks similar to untrained eyes. This is the problem of modernity meeting tradition, speed meeting slowness, the market economy meeting craft that never commodified itself, that always understood itself as something beyond mere production. The weavers face an impossible choice. Maintain traditional techniques and quality and price yourself out of the market, unable to earn enough to survive, or speed up production, lower quality. Make approximations of traditional textiles that tourists can afford, but that lose the very qualities that made them meaningful in the first place. Some communities have found middle paths, cooperatives that help weavers get fair prices for traditional work. UNESCO recognition of traditional weaving as intangible cultural heritage, which brings attention and sometimes protection. Museums and collectors willing to pay appropriate prices for textiles created using genuine traditional techniques. Schools and workshops that teach young people the old methods, trying to ensure that knowledge passes to the next generation. But it's precarious. Every generation, fewer people learn. Every year, more traditional patterns are forgotten. More natural dye recipes are lost. More subtle techniques disappear because the person who knew them died and didn't quite manage to pass on all their knowledge before the end. This is how traditions die. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly through the accumulation of small losses, knowledge that doesn't quite make it from one generation to the next. In some villages, grandmothers still teach granddaughters the old ways, not from books, because most of this knowledge has never been written down, not from videos or online tutorials, hand to hand, thread by thread. This is how you prepare the fiber, washing it, carding it, preparing it for spinning. This is how you spin. The drop spindle twirling, the twist of the thread controlled by subtle movements of wrist and fingers. This is how you set up a backstrap loom, tying the sticks with just the right tension. This is how you weave, reading the pattern as you work, keeping the tension consistent, beating each row just tight enough but not too tight. This is how you honor what we were. The methods haven't changed in 3,000 years. The reasons they no longer weave to clothe an empire. They no longer weave to create offerings for gods. They no longer weave because the empire demands tribute or because their identity as women requires it. They weave to remember, to maintain a connection to ancestors who wove the same way, to preserve knowledge that they understand is valuable even if the market doesn't reward it appropriately, to keep alive a tradition that stretches back through countless generations. All the way to that first woman on a mountainside who twisted plant fibers together and discovered that patience could create strength. You stand now in a present that is not quite your own time, but is moving toward it. The looms are mostly silent. A few women work at backstrap looms, but they're older, in their 60s or 70s. The younger women are in the cities, working in shops or restaurants or as domestic workers, earning money in ways that don't require years of training and months of work to produce a single item. Economic necessity pushes them away from weaving. Modernization offers opportunities that traditional craft cannot match. And yet, some young people are learning, not many, but some, drawn to the tradition for new reasons, environmental consciousness, recognizing that traditional weaving uses sustainable materials and methods, cultural pride, wanting to maintain connection to indigenous identity, artistic interest, seeing in traditional textiles a form of expression that machine production can never replicate, economic opportunity, as some markets develop for authentic high-end traditional textiles. They're learning the same way their ancestors learned. Slowly, patiently, hands moving over threads, making mistakes, unweaving and starting over, gradually developing the muscle memory and the eye and the patience that traditional weaving demands. They're discovering what every weaver before them discovered. This is hard. This is tedious. This takes forever. And somehow, if you stay with it long enough, it becomes meditative, becomes meaningful, becomes something more than just making cloth. The thread that connects that first twisted fiber to the present day has frayed but not broken. It's thinner than it used to be, more fragile. It could break in the next generation if not enough people choose to maintain it, but it's still there, still connecting present to past, still carrying forward knowledge that has survived empire and conquest and colonization and modernization. You think back to that woman you saw on your first day here, thousands of years ago in some sense, just days ago in another, sitting on a mountainside, spinning thread with a drop spindle, the motion of her hands, the rhythm of the work that hasn't changed. The thread she was creating then is the same thread being created now. Same techniques, same materials, same patience. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have advanced beyond anything the Inca could have imagined. But thread is still thread. Weaving is still weaving. And the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Anything worth making takes time, not the frantic, rushing time of modern productivity, where faster is always better and efficiency is the highest value. But slow time, patient time, the kind of time that measures progress in threads rather than seconds. The kind of time that accepts that perfection might take months or years. And that's not a problem to solve, but simply the nature of the work. The Inca built an empire on this understanding. They took the slowest possible approach to everything. Weaving, record-keeping, administration. While other civilizations developed writing to speed up information transmission, the Inca stuck with quipus, which were slower but more durable. While other cultures found ways to speed up textile production, the Inca maintained techniques that prioritize quality over quantity, fineness over speed. This seems backward, seems inefficient, until you remember that their textiles have survived 500 years in tombs and still look perfect, while most modern clothing falls apart after a few washes. Maybe the lesson isn't that we should all go back to backstrap looms and give up modern conveniences. That's not realistic and probably not desirable. But maybe there's something worth remembering about the relationship between time and value, about the difference between things made quickly and things made well, about what we lose when we prioritize speed above all else, about what kinds of knowledge and skill and patience disappear when we decide that anything taking too long isn't worth doing. You've spent hours, days, weeks watching weaving, watching the slowest process imaginable, watching thread being created, looms being set up, cloth gradually, impossibly gradually, coming into being. And somehow, despite or perhaps because of the slowness, it's been meaningful. The repetition that seemed boring at first became meditative. The patience that seemed unnecessary became admirable. The time that seemed wasted became something else. Time invested in understanding. Time spent in a different relationship with making and having and being. As sleep approaches on this final night, as your mind releases its grip on these complex questions about tradition and modernity and the meaning of craft in a world that increasingly values only speed, you let yourself sink back into the rhythm that has defined this entire journey. Thread over, thread under, beat, thread over, thread under, beat. The same motion repeated for thousands of years by millions of hands, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge and skill and patience that connects the deep past to the uncertain present to whatever future is coming. The Inca didn't weave quickly. They wove forever. They wove with the understanding that some things are worth doing slowly, carefully, with complete attention, even if that means they take months or years to complete. They wove with the knowledge that time invested in quality is never wasted. They wove with the patience to maintain standards across generations, to pass down knowledge hand to hand, to preserve techniques, not because they were efficient, but because they produced something remarkable. And in the end, that's what survived. Not the empire, not the gold, not the military conquests or the imperial administration or the names of emperors. What survived was thread, was weaving, was the knowledge carried in hands that learned from other hands, passed down through generations, maintained through conquest and colonization and modernization. The techniques that seemed most vulnerable, most outdated, most likely to disappear. Those are what endured, because you cannot unweave muscle memory. You cannot burn the knowledge that lives in hands. You cannot destroy the patterns that grandmothers teach granddaughters in quiet moments. When the looms are set up and the threads are ready and there's nothing to do but begin. Thread over, thread under, beat again and again and again until the work is done, until perfection is achieved, until the patience of thousands of years, compressed into these simple motions, produces something that will outlast us all. Thread by thread, day by day, generation by generation, the weaving continues. Slower now, get there, less certain of its future, but continuing nonetheless, because some knowledge is too valuable to let die, even when the market doesn't reward it, even when modernity has passed it by, even when it seems impractical and outdated and hopelessly slow. The last sound you hear before sleep finally claims you as the soft beat of a weaver at her loom. Somewhere nearby, someone is working late, finishing a piece, or unable to sleep, or simply maintaining the rhythm that has defined her life and her mother's life and her grandmother's life before that. Beat, beat, beat. The sound of patience, the sound of tradition, the sound of time moving at the speed of thread, the sound of an empire that fell 500 years ago, but somehow, impossibly, is still here, still present, still weaving itself into existence one thread at a time, slowly, patiently, forever.